As Joe said before, my name is Dr. Josh Siepel. I'm based at Sprue at the University of Sussex, but I spend a lot of my time at the moment working on something called the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Center. Now, that's a big sort of fancy thing that sounds really impressive. What it really is it's based on a recognition that happened a couple of years ago that fundamentally we collectively in the UK didn't know enough about the creative industries. And so I'll talk about what creative industries means in a moment, but creative businesses, we didn't know enough about creative things. We know that they have kind of intrinsic cultural benefits. We know there's also substantial economic benefits, but we didn't really know that much about them. And in order to be able to properly support these businesses and these creative sectors, the government, as part of the UK industrial strategy, launched something called the Creative Clusters Program and funded this organization that I'm now working with, where we're trying to build a policy, an evidence base for policy making to better understand and better support the creative industries and creative business. And as an academic at Sussex University, I've been working on this for the past couple of years, and it's been really fascinating. So one of the things we've been doing on this is something that's been quite cool called Creative Radar. And this is one of the largest scale exercises that's ever been engaged to actually try to understand and map what's going on with creative businesses around the UK. Now, we did this using a number of different techniques. We used hundreds of thousands of scraped web pages. We scraped the content of web pages. We did a load of surveys. We did interviews. We did lots of different things trying to map what's going on. And what that's allowed us to do is generate some nice, pretty pictures around this. And one of the things that we've sort of realized, some of the insights that we've generated from this broader work, and this is work that sort of was originally pre-COVID, was something that we called microclusters. And the idea about microclusters is that we tend to think about places that are creative. We think, well, Brighton is a creative place. And indeed, Brighton is a creative place. But at the same time, within Brighton, which places are particularly creative? We know that there are places like the North Lane. There are other places like the Brunswick area. There's places around New England House and around there. And we've been trying to understand very small areas, kind of neighborhoods, on the basis that these neighborhoods may very well be a source, we now realize after the fact, a source and an area where resilience can happen, because that's where some of the real magic happens. And we mapped 700 of these microclusters around the UK, and we've been studying them. The really interesting thing is we started studying them just before the pandemic, and then we've been able to follow some of these companies through the pandemic to see what they've got up to. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about in our talk today. Now, particularly around some of this research that we've been doing, we know that COVID has had a huge impact on the creative industries. And I think, we don't have to look far in the introduction and everywhere else. It was not difficult to see, for those of us who are interested in creative and cultural organizations and spaces and businesses and things like that, the instant level of devastation in the first instance. You've got venues closed, you've got festivals postponed and then canceled, you've got cinema releases that are pushed back and back and back, you've got customers who can't meet their clients, and all of these things that were going on. And so for this reason, there was a lot of concern, and indeed well-founded concern, that COVID could have a truly destructive effect on the creative industries in the UK. And in that context, we went and we surveyed a number of several hundred businesses that we'd contacted just before the recession, before the pandemic, to ask them how they'd got on. And these are some of the things that we found in our report. One of the key things that I think is really important to emphasize that we found is that the impact of COVID was highly uneven. And so whilst at the same time, when we think about creative businesses, yes, arts and culture had a very, very difficult time. And there were some real existential worries about the future of many arts organizations, up to the point when when the Treasury announced some targeted support for some of these businesses. But at the same time, in our study, we also found that some creative businesses did very well. The gaming sector had not necessarily, you wouldn't really say they had a good pandemic, but a situation where you've got lots of people at home created lots of new markets for people, for instance, in the gaming sector. And what we found was that the impact of COVID was very, very different across a lot of different sectors. So performing arts, one of the worst affected sectors like gaming, did relatively well. And so on that, we found the impact of COVID was highly uneven. And even within areas such as we saw with many businesses that were working with freelancers, lots of businesses, because all their work dried up, they worked with many fewer freelancers, but some grew and touched on their freelancers and drew on and used freelancers more and more reliably than they ever had before. And so one of the things that we realized is that the impact of COVID was uneven. At the same time, what we saw is that a lot of companies, in terms of how they responded to COVID, many companies responded to COVID with innovation. So we found in our national survey, in our national study, we found about 40% of businesses developed new products to reflect the change marketplace as a result of COVID. A similar number started targeting new customers who they hadn't targeted before, often at a much broader range, selling globally or selling nationally where they'd only been selling locally. So there was a lot of things like this. About a third of companies in our sample invested more in R&D and innovative activities, trying to take advantage and trying to build up from these. And so my point in this is not to say that it's not been a near catastrophic crisis in a lot of cases, because indeed it was, but there were pockets of opportunity, there were pockets of resilience that we need to be aware of and see if we can learn from. Now, one of the things which is really interesting about that our findings showed about this is that, generally speaking, location didn't really matter as much about how companies responded to the pandemic. Now, this is important because when we look back to the last financial crisis at the end of the 2000s, one of the impacts that our Research and Policy and Evidence Center has shown is that what that recession and that financial crisis served to do was to really hammer creative businesses, particularly outside London. And so it really reinforced London's dominance as sort of the UK's largest creative hub at the expense of the regions. In the UK, during the pandemic, the factor which was more important here was sector. Can you open? Can you do what you normally do as a result of the restrictions around businesses being able to open, being able to do things the way that they've normally done? So location wasn't as much of a factor in this. And so the challenges that companies in Brighton are facing, by and large, are the same that companies in Manchester are facing, same that companies in Bristol are facing, as in London, as in Edinburgh, across the board, and arguably possibly even around the world. And so, as I said before, some companies, they thrive through the pandemic. And one of the things which is very interesting that our research showed is that in the first year of the pandemic, including the first three, the three biggest lockdowns, relatively few companies actually failed. Fewer companies failed, went out of business in that time than you would have actually expected, which was quite a surprising fact. What that meant, though, is that as a lot of companies thrived through the pandemic, and then others were able to sort of keep their heads above water through the use of things like the furlough scheme. So we found about 2/3 of companies in our sample, of our national sample, had relied on furlough and had furloughed employees, which has proved to have a massive impact on the job situation and the employment, keeping these businesses going. The challenge that we face now, thinking about resilience, is that yes, okay, we're coming to, we hope, no one knows, we hope we're coming to the end of COVID. And we hope that this is going to be something that we're now sort of adjusting to whatever the new normal might possibly be. At the same time, there's a bit of a perfect storm that we now face with the lingering, ongoing remains of the COVID pandemic, the risk of new variants, but at the same time, things such as Brexit, also issues around the current situation with inflation, lack of consumer spending, issues around supply chains, and these challenges that are pervasive indeed across the entire economy are issues that I think are likely to be prevalent and things that we need to be thinking about for the creative industries and creative businesses now. And so I think in a lot of cases for many businesses, they were able to survive thanks to furlough and thanks to loans and other public support. Now, with all of those being phased out, the question is, what's going to happen now? And so this really speaks to the importance of trying to build up and supporting creative businesses through these times and helping companies over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 months, next year, to continue to weather what may be quite turbulent situations. Now, on one level, that's not exactly a cheery message, but at the same time, I think it's important for us to realize that this is a very complex time we live in. We are blessed stroke cursed to live in a very, very interesting, very complex time in history. And once we are aware of that, I think that puts us in a better position to understand what we can do to support and ensure that companies are more resilient going forward. Now, let's talk a little bit about Brighton specifically. So Brighton and Greater Brighton, which includes some of the areas outside. I mean, I think many, if not all of the people here will be quite familiar with Brighton as a cluster. Brighton, thinking about the figures that Joe mentioned at the beginning, Brighton is one of the most vibrant cities in terms of creative industries, and as a creative cluster, it's one of the most vibrant places in the UK for this. And it's characterized in particular by many, many more people sort of per capita working in areas such as performing arts and things like this than most other cities in the UK. And that helps to provide some of this really interesting, exciting resilience that makes Brighton as a city so interesting. At the same time, that and the fact that that Brighton is characterized by a lot of freelancers and a lot of people who may not have sort of the traditional kind of employee-employer work relationships, introduced a lot of challenges for the sector, and it meant that Brighton was more exposed, perhaps, than other parts of the economy. Now, with that said, one of the things that we found when we did a separate survey, which we did specifically looking at how companies in Greater Brighton had responded to the pandemic, one of the things that we found that was really, really interesting was that companies in Brighton performed virtually, the challenges that we saw nationally were almost identical to the challenges that were happening in Brighton. So there was very, very few differences. So in both cases, about 2/3 of businesses had said their operations were severely disrupted by COVID. But at the same time, about half of those companies had said that they'd substantially changed their business model. 40% said that they had launched new products in response to the pandemic. A similar number had said they'd managed to find new customers. So we see this real shift and this real push and these moves for resilience that were already happening as a part of the response to the pandemic in these areas. And the challenge that we have now is how to build on those and how to encourage those. And one of the things that we have been talking about in our research, and this is a map of the Greater Brighton area for those of you who aren't familiar with what exactly constitutes Greater Brighton. But as part of our research on these microclusters, which we are hypothesizing are sort of one of the sort of roots of resilience within creative clusters, we've identified about 10 microclusters around the Greater Brighton area. And of these, we found that these companies, particularly in the pandemic, tended to draw much more of their strength from their local connections. So they leaned into that community to try to give them kind of strength and support and connections to keep themselves going through the challenging times of the pandemic. And what we are hoping that we will be able to see, and what we're going to be looking for as we continue with our data collection over the next few years, is we are hoping to see the extent to which these companies, which were by and large sort of co-located and as part of these communities, even despite the disruptions from working at home and all of those things, are able to use this spirit and sense and the fact there's sort of something buzzing in the air in Brighton and all of this that those of us who are familiar with Brighton know and love. If that then can provide the basis for a recovery and provide the basis for new forms of resilience. Now, I mean, just to sort of summarize where we're going with this, as I've said, there are some real challenges that we're facing. You know, the broader environment across the whole of the economy is going to look to be very, very tricky. But at the same time, one of the things which, for me personally, as a researcher and as an academic, which I find really interesting in studying creative industries and creative businesses, is that yes, there's the economic side. And yes, we can study, you know, the economic stuff, which is interesting if you're an academic and a bit of a dork like me. But the thing which is also really powerful about this is that creative industries change lives. You know, the things that we do, you know, the books we read, the ideas that we engage with, you know, the stories that you know, break our hearts or inspire us, and all of those things, those come through these creative businesses. And all, you know, in the vast sort of array of everything that we see amongst businesses that draw on creativity. And so there's a really important role as we go forward for creative businesses thinking, you know, it's about resilience, and yes, it's about the economic side. At the same time, it's also about the inspirations rising to the challenges that we've seen, and trying to set out visions for what a more robust, a more fair, a more equitable, a more diverse world, more sustainable world might look like. And so this is the prospect, and this is the challenge, and this is where I think it's really important. Now that we know where we are, it sets the stage for us to think about what we can do and what might happen next. So on that note, just to kind of summarize some of my points here, COVID was very disruptive in creative industries, but it varied massively. It varied between sectors more rather necessarily than location. So how Brighton did was very similar to how the rest of the country did, by and large. Some companies did well, others struggled a little bit. And what we will be seeing now in our next rounds of data collections, we'll be able to see how that recovery has worked. Greater Brighton, I think, gives us a good microcosm of the issues that we face. But at the same time, we see the potential for creativity, creative businesses as part of rebuilding in a stronger and more resilient way.